So last week we finally got to the first of the Ten Commandments of Christ, right? And we learned that it's very clear from all of the Beatitudes and from that first commandment that God is very concerned with the condition of the heart, particularly because it's the driver of speech and action. While I make some introductory comments here, go to Mark chapter 7. Excuse me. The context here in Mark 7 is that the Pharisees were complaining that Jesus' disciples weren't washing their hands before they ate. I know you guys know that story, but I have a question before we read this in Mark 7. Before the Jews ate, they were required to wash their hands and then recite a blessing, right? They had to use if possible, use a two-handed pitcher. They were supposed to pour water twice with the right hand and then twice with the left hand, and they were supposed to recite a prayer that says, "Blessed are you, Lord, O God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us concerning the washings of hands." And that might sound familiar to you because we've actually used that when we've done our Seder meals at Passover as we go through the progression of that night. But here's the question. Which part of the law required ritual hand washing before a meal?
Other than Passover.
Ceremonial laws, you mean?
Which part of the law? Like which chapter, which verse, which book?
Oh,
I don't know.
to be repent.
Is it there?
No, it's not. That's the point. It's a complete fabrication of Pharisaic Judaism, which was later continued with rabbinical Judaism after the temple was destroyed. And I've shared with you before how rabbinical Judaism is just the modern era extension of the Pharisees. In fact, if you search the Bible for like ritual washings or washings, the first thing that you see the story where at Mount Sinai, God told Moses to get the whole nation to wash themselves for 3 days before they approached Mount Sinai, right before the Lord came down. And then the next time you see ritual washings mentioned, it's about Aaron, the high priest, and his son, and the Levites, but all of those commandments are related to and associated with temple worship. And then throughout the law, you see instructions for individuals to wash for having become impure for some reason, whether it was because they touched like a dead body, or a woman with her menstrual period, or sometimes leprosy with patches showing up and that kind of stuff. But there's actually no law through the Old Testament that's written down that required hand washing before a meal. But it's interesting to note, you might remember this from our Mazzaroth study, that one of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that the Sadducees taught that the Jews only had to follow the purity laws when they were at the temple and not in regular life, whereas the Pharisees taught the opposite. They taught that all of the temple-based purity laws, like ritual washings, had to be observed at home, right? Hence the ritual washing of the hands and reciting this blessing every time they ate a meal. But it was something that the Pharisees made up. It was something that they taught over and above the actual law. And once again, they missed the entire point of the symbolism of ritual washing and turned the whole process into some kind of a legalistic observation. Now, this kind of relates to the whole thing that we've been saying from the beginning, is that with the Ten Commandments, Jesus is predominantly overturning the oral teaching of the Pharisees, right? So here in Mark 7, verse 14, says, "When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, 'Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from the outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear.' When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, 'Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Because it doesn't enter his heart, but his stomach, and it's eliminated, thus purifying all foods," right? And the key phrase there is that it doesn't enter the heart. And he says to them, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceeds evil thoughts and adulteries, fornications, murder, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. Now that might help a little bit with a question that I asked last week was, which was preferable? Was it better to sacrifice fellowship with other people who don't believe exactly what we believe for the sake of not being exposed to what we see as false teaching? Or is it better to have the fellowship with like-minded believers from, at least from a heart standpoint, even though you might be in an environment where doctrine isn't quite so pure? Right? And this is more rhetorical. If you visit a friend's church where the pastor teaches a lesson, say on once saved, always saved, or the pre-trib rapture, which we don't believe is biblical, does that defile you because you just heard false doctrine, or you're in an environment where that actually is being taught? And maybe it's not. Let me ask you. It's not a rhetorical question. Does that defile you just because you're in a church that teaches something that's wrong?
No, because I have an understanding of what the scriptures actually said, and that's not going to persuade me any differently.
Yeah, and I would say that in most cases, and I can't emphasize most cases enough, that the value of fellowship with good-hearted people who might be doctrinally wrong outweighs the bad doctrine. Most cases, right? Because there are some things that churches teach that are so far, I don't think we should be in and around them. But, that's particularly if you as an individual, like Walter just said, are solid enough in your faith and your understanding that you can endure listening to something that's incorrect without it causing you to doubt what you already know is true. Right? Don't underestimate the value of the fellowship. Now, we're going to come back to this concept a little bit later, but you remember, I think it was actually might have been in our last lesson, or not lesson, our last series. Of course, it could have been in one of the introductory sessions in this particular series because we did 10 or 11 of them. But you remember when we talked about how the Bible verse that says that the eye is the lamp of the body? And I shared with you how ancient cultures looked at the eye as a projector of light, like your eye shines light on things and that's how you see, versus a receiver of light, which is actually how they work. And we said that was, Jesus was teaching that whatever you focus on with your mind tends to determine the condition of your heart, right? And so ultimately we understand the heart is the springboard for our words and deeds. If you go back and listen, because Tim's old sermon, or 10 Commandments of Christ series, is still available on audio on the website. And I remember him saying at one point that the mouth is the dipstick of the heart. Right? You want to know what's in someone's heart? Just listen to the words that they say. And I thought that was pretty cool, especially because Tim was a mechanic and all that stuff. But, if we understand that the heart is the dipstick the mouth is the dipstick of the heart, we also have to understand that the heart has ports of entry. The heart has access points through which external things can get into the heart, right? So go to Romans chapter 3. Paul actually paints a pretty ugly picture of the human heart and of the tongue. But in these verses, and we're going to read Romans 3, 10 to 18, he points out two of these access points. Right? There's actually 4 ways things can get into your heart. Let's see if you can pick out the 2 that he lists here as we go through. So Romans 3, verse 10, as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There are none who understand. There's none who seek after God. They have all turned aside. They've altogether become unprofitable. There was none who does good, no, not one. And this is the ugly part, right? Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And ultimately, that's the problem. They don't fear God. But what are the points of entry into the heart? Like, again, Paul points to 2 of them there. But just before you look at that, or looking at that, What do you think what are the 4 different ways things can get into our heart?
Things we see and things we hear.
Yeah, that's kind of the obvious ones, right? Because we just went through, well, we're getting ready to go through guard your eyes as a commandment. But, in this section of verses, he points to the feet and to the eyes. And we'll talk about the eyes here in the second commandment. But, these 4 ports of entry into the heart are your eyes, your ears, your hands, and your feet. Now, the eyes and the ears are kind of easy to understand, but how can feet and hands be a port of entry into your heart?
Well, if you use your feet to go into some place where you should not be, you can get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, right? So I look at the feet, this kind of allegory, as it relates to the situations and the circumstances that you routinely allow yourself to be in. It's really kind of the path that you follow. All right, and the easiest example to illustrate the concept would be, maybe a worldly Christian who finds himself or herself, frequenting the bars and the nightclubs on the weekends on a routine basis, right? There's going to be an impact on the heart if that's the environment that you allow if your feet follow that path, that's going to affect your heart for sure. What about the hands? How can the hands be a port of entry into the heart?
By typing in on your laptop or computer to go to places you shouldn't go.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. But that's, in the modern era, that's actually pretty appropriate. And throughout the Bible, it talks about like putting your hand to the plow, and really in some cases it just literally talks about what you're doing with your hands, but in others it's a metaphor for the things that you do, the things that you apply yourself to, again, on a routine basis, right? So whatever you do routinely trains your mind and it affects your heart. So what you habitually do comes from your heart, but it actually turns back around and trains your heart in somewhat of a reflexive way. And just to hit the point one more time, you don't have to go there, but I'm going to quote from Matthew 12. Jesus said this to the Pharisees in Matthew 12:34. Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word that men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Right? And that kind of concludes the first commandment, which was watch your mouth. So we're going to move now into the second commandment, which is guard your eyes. Go back to Matthew 5. If I haven't directed you there yet, go back to Matthew 5. We're going to read 27 to 32, and then we're going to break it into 2, maybe 3 different sections. And depending on how quickly we get through some stuff, I might just get through the first part of it. So Matthew 5:27, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, the way that Jesus said this, it sounds like he's given the women just kind of a free pass, as if women can't lust, as if women can't commit adultery. And of course, we know that's true. So, what we're going to talk about here isn't only for the men, even though it's kind of written that way. So in these verses here, where it talks about a man committing adultery with a woman through lust, Are the man who is lusting in this scenario and the woman being lusted after, are they married or unmarried?
Unmarried.
They're unmarried?
Well, the man,
Are they both unmarried?
well, in verse 27, it doesn't really say that until you get. Well, no, yeah, yes, he would be married. Yes.
One or both?
One.
One.
I would say at least one, right? It could possibly be both, but at least one has to be married. Otherwise, the conversation would be about fornication and not adultery, right? Does that make sense? And that's just making sure that we pay attention to what's being said and apply just a little bit of logic. But just like all murder, we said this last week, all murder is killing, but not all killing is murder, right? And the difference is that murder is the killing of an innocent. In this scenario, all adultery is fornication, but not all fornication is adultery if the fornicators, if neither one of them are married, thinking premarital sex.
Right.
But if you remember that it seems to be that Jesus' core purpose and intent is to overturn oral tradition and teaching from the Pharisees. Here's how I think we should read verse 27. Let me just read it, and I'm going to emphasize it maybe in a different way than you might be reading it in your head. So I think verse 27 should be read this way. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. If you read it that way, does that change your impression of what Jesus was actually saying?
What do you mean?
I'm not hearing your distinction.
So if I just simply say with the same intonation, you have heard that it was said of old, you shall not commit adultery, versus emphasizing the word commit, you shall not commit adultery. What does that allow for?
Oh. One and done, or is that what you mean?
No, not one and done. What does Jesus follow up with? But I say to you,
In the Old Testament, then you actually commit the actual act, but in the New Testament, he is saying if you commit the act in your mind.
right.
Pharisees thought that, well, we're okay. We can have all the lustful stuff we want. The actual act, we're good.
Yeah, and that's the precise emphasis, or the reason why I was emphasizing the word commit, because if you read it that way, and if you understand that that's what Jesus is pointing to, then he's saying that according to the Pharisees, as long as you don't commit the act, you can entertain it. You can lust after someone, you can flirt with them, you can dance around the edges of committing adultery, but as long as you don't act on it, then you're okay. Right? That's the distinction that Jesus is making. So, but again, Jesus says, He says, I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So just like we saw last week with, watching your mouth, Jesus once again shifts the standard away from the Pharisees and their self-serving oral teaching, and he shifts it back to the intent of the law. And again, Jesus points to the heart as the driver of the behavior, right? Plenty of people who lust don't commit the act of adultery. But nobody commits adultery without first having looked and lusted, because that's where it starts.
Right.
So I want to look at the words to lust and to look a little bit more deeper. And I hope I'm not saying something that's too obvious here, right? Because sometimes when I read verse 28, where he says, but I say to you, whoever looks at a woman, sometimes in my mind, I don't read it as it's written. I read it as whoever looks at a woman in lust has already committed adultery within her heart. But, and I don't know if anybody else has a tendency to read it that way, that you're looking at a woman in lust. But if you do, what's the difference between saying that a man looks at a woman in lust versus looking at a woman to lust? What's the difference?
Motivation.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it.
Dwelling on it, like just
Yeah, I think when you read it as looking at a woman in lust, that describes the look itself, like it's a lusty look, it's a seductive look. But as Jesus wrote it, that the man is looking at a woman to lust, he's describing the intent and the purpose. Why are you looking? The purpose of the look is to lust, right? But I think there's a circular relationship here, right? Looking to lust causes more looking in lust, right? I don't know that we can separate it, but I think Jesus wrote it said it in a very specific way to imply the intent and the purpose of the look itself. Right. And in fact, he used a very specific grammatical construction, which I don't want to go into the grammar, but he used a grammatical construction that implies intent rather than result. Right? The lusty look wasn't the result. The lusty look was, or the intent of the look was the lust itself. And he said that the intent being to lust was the equivalent of adultery, again, because lust begins, or adultery begins in the heart itself. And by the way, anybody know what the word lust means? How would you describe it?
modern?
Modern? Is that what you said?
No, I'm asking. You mean?
Well, of course, I'm going to go to the Greek word, so.
Yeah.
But it really means the same thing. I think maybe the meaning may have dulled over time, but the Greek word, it's actually a compound word that means to burn over. Literally means to burn over, and the implication is to burn with passion. So we understand what lust is. We understand that the look that Jesus is talking about, the purpose and the intent, is to burn over a woman who's captured their interest. Let's take a look at the word to look. And the word look here just simply carries the plain meaning of the word. So there's nothing hidden there. There's nothing special to understand about the meaning of the word. But the key thing with how Jesus said it and how Matthew wrote it is that it's presented as what's called a present active participle. And that just simply means that even though it's a verb, it actually functions like an adjective. So the English translation doesn't capture this, but in the Greek, literally it says the looking ones. It says the looking ones, not whoever looks. It's the looking ones. But because it's written in the present tense, it shows us, and that present tense typically shows us continuous, ongoing, present action. And so what Jesus is talking about, he's not talking about a glance. He's not talking about like a simple, fleeting appreciation of someone's beauty and appeal. He's talking about, and I think Kathy kind of hinted at this, he's talking about fixing a lingering gaze with the particular intent of feeding the fire of illicit passion and desire. That's what he's talking about here, right? We might use the word ogling or ogling, depending on how you want to pronounce that word. And I think here's why it's important for us in today's day and age. Women, young and old, dress so provocatively that they present themselves as a source of temptation to the men around them. And I don't know that I have anyone here tonight who would disagree with that, right? Even in the church. All you have to do is go to one of the big box churches in Florida in the summer, and you'll see a whole bunch of ladies in short shorts and halter tops in church. And you'll see the mom and the teenage girls all dressed the same way, and the dad right in the middle of them. It's striking. It's striking the way that, and I'm sure it's the same in other cities, right? We also have social media where not just women, but people are posting all kinds of pictures for pretty much anyone to see. And then we have everything that's in the movies and the TV shows where the producers and directors and actors and actresses seem to have lost all sense of propriety. Now, I need to be clear that I'm not a prude, I'm not a legalist, nor am I perfect. And I don't always, watching movies, for example, I don't always vet the movies ahead of time to see what's in them. And sometimes I get surprised. And for this part, I'm talking mostly to the guys here tonight. Let's just say that you're watching a movie that you haven't checked for content before you watch it. And all of a sudden, without any warning, there's like a naked woman on the screen and you get an eye full of her stuff. Does the fact that you saw a naked woman defile you?
No.
Why do you say that, Vera?
Because you didn't actually visualize in your mind what you would do to her.
That's pretty accurate, right? It's not, remember Jesus just said, it's not what goes into you that defiles you, but it's what comes out. Like you might get exposed, whether it's a guy seeing a girl seeing a guy, or whatever it is that has the potential to drive lust. It's what you do with the trigger that makes the difference, right? It's not the initial look that gets you. It's that continued look and your imagination and what you do after that ignites those fires. And so, if you're in that situation, let's say that there's a young guy watching, an old guy, doesn't matter, watching a movie, and all of a sudden there's a naked girl. And now if you use your DVR and you pause the movie just so you can look, if you rewind it so you can play the scene over and over again, then that's a problem. If you continue to watch and there's stuff happening on the screen, then there's a problem. It's just the fact that you saw something doesn't defile you. It's what you do after that moment that's really, really important. So, go ahead, Vera.
Couldn't you say then you actually are committing adultery?
In what way?
If you're going back and you're looking and you're going back and you're looking, you're actually putting the imagery of what you're doing.
Well, I would say if you are a married person, absolutely. Yeah. Right? If you're unmarried, then you're mentally fornicating, I guess. Right? The context here is what happens when a married person, the implication of Jesus' scenario is, what if a married person does this, right? So there's, any number of ways to protect your eyes in this sense, right? You can, there are websites where you can look for the graphic content, right? imdb.com is a parental advisory section. Plugged In Online has the same thing. And, for yourselves, for your own sake, I'm to the point now where I routinely will get online to check to see what's in something before I commit to watching it. Right? I used to wait until something happened before I checked to see how bad it was going to get. Now I'm trying to do that ahead of time. And
I'm
listen.
so glad you said that.
Mary.
You kind of left that open. It's like, wait, no.
Yeah, Mary.
When you think of the women and how they have to keep themselves covered up, the men have so little self-control that the poor women have to go around in hot weather wearing all these burqas and all this other stuff. Last, the men start lusting after them. It's like awful, the poor women.
Yeah, so here's again just a couple of suggestions, right? For the guys particularly, but girls I think it applies as well, right? If there's a movie or a TV show you want to watch, but you can't because there's nudity or sex or language or violence or something that you don't want to be exposed to, you either choose to not watch it, or these days you've got these filtering services. There's one called VidAngel, which actually comes from the Seventh-day Adventist group, where you can watch something and it'll take out, you just say like, I don't want to hear cuss language, I don't want to see nudity or sex scenes, and it will filter all that stuff out you, right? So there's options. For the men in particular, if you're around a woman and having a conversation with a lady who might be dressed a little less than conservatively, make sure you look at her face. Talk to her and look her in the eyes. Don't look anywhere else, right? And these are just practical things that I'm sure everybody understands. James said in chapter 1, he said, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. But it's interesting, he uses these two words, desire and enticed, and the word desire is the noun form of the verb to lust that Jesus used back in Matthew chapter 5. Right? So if we were to translate that a different way, but each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own lust and enticed. And the word enticed is interesting because it literally means to be baited. Like if you go fishing, you don't just throw a line with a metal hook on the end. You stick something on the hook, something that you think the fish are going to like, whether it's a wiggly worm or a shrimp or something else, right? You're going to catch a lot more fish if you've got the right bait. But the fish have to take the bait. And that's what James is saying, is that if you're drawn away by your own lust and you take the bait, then that conceives and the birth of that conception is sin.
Yeah.
But here's the question, like if it's our own lust, how can we be drawn away by our own lust, and how can we be baited?
I think it's a married person. If you and your wife have a really good, strong marriage and a good, strong relationship, and you really love one another, what business do you have of looking, like they say, drink water out of your own well?
Yeah.
Drink water out of your own well and be satisfied with your wife. You shouldn't be out there looking.
Yeah. I think part of the Christian life, both male and female, is to control what goes into our eyes and our hearts and our, or into our hearts through our eyes and our ears and all that kind of stuff. But, James talks here about that moment when desire or lust baits you and then you give into it, right? There's a moment when you're presented with something that's tempting in which you can choose to ignore, turn around, and win the battle, or you can surrender your will to fight and you just go along for the joyride. And it takes practice to win that fight, particularly if you are, let's say that you're new to the Christian life and you're used to just giving in to whatever whim comes your way. As a Christian, the first time that you're presented with a temptation that now as a Christian is wrong, but you have trained yourself to say yes, sometimes it's hard to say no.
Yes, that's true.
When I was, before I became a Christian, I did, in my early 20s, I did a lot of study and reading in Eastern traditions, and I remember reading a story about a Taoist master and his protege were walking in the forest, and they come across this beautiful but scantily clad young woman who asked their help to cross this river that she couldn't get across herself. And without hesitation, the older man bent down to pick her up and motioned to his pupil to help. And he hesitated, but he complied, trying without success to not look at her near nakedness the whole time. And on the other side, they put her down and they bade her farewell and they went on their way. But the younger man kept looking back to the river and then to his master and then back and back. And, finally he was, baffled and confused and somewhat tortured, and he couldn't take it anymore. And he said, "Master, we should never have helped her and touched her. She was young, she was beautiful, she was barely clothed, and she was a great temptation to sin." And the old man, completely undisturbed, said to him, "I put her down back at the river, and it seems like you're still carrying her." The reality is that the world and the training of our old lives will bring temptation. The question is, at what point do you decide to be preemptive? Right? And if you're enticed, do you take the bait and let the seed of sin grow? Seeing something that we ought not to see is not the same as intentionally looking for the purpose of lusting. But it doesn't mean we give ourselves a free pass to just go watch and see anything we want just to go, okay, well, that didn't defile me, right? I still think that we have to be cautious. Vera.
Well, it kind of sounds almost too like pornography.
Yeah. Pornography is a huge problem, not just with men, but with women as well. And it's a problem at younger and younger ages because of what Walter said. You know, you can sin with your fingers, just get online and type in anything you want. And now pornography is becoming a problem in elementary schools.
But I can see where that could be actually adultery and fornication.
Yeah. From Jesus' standard, yes, it is. It certainly is. I want you to go to 2 Peter chapter 1. Because this problem with lust, this problem of entertaining things in your mind and looking to feed that fire, there is a solution, right? Jesus has a solution, but we're going to start with Peter because Peter has a solution as well. And while we're turning there, again, 2 Peter 1, here's a question. Does adultery happen by accident?
No.
Never, right? Ever. It is like, oh, I just tripped and committed adultery. Whoops. Right? It's the fruit of this improper desire that's allowed to grow because someone takes the bait and surrenders to the lusting and to the looking. So what does Peter say? Like, how do we guard ourselves against that? Here Peter is talking about lust in a larger sense in the context of that driven self-interest that we talked about during the first beatitude, right? And we'll come back to Matthew 5 where Jesus cones it down to sexual lust in a second, but the principle is really the same. So 2 Peter 1, verse 1, Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle to Jesus, to those who obtain like precious faith with us by righteousness of our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ. Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue, by which have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust, right? So lust leads to corruption. But back in verse 3, what does Peter mean when he says that God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness?
Well, it's through the knowledge of him.
It is.
And we have his written word.
We do.
Of course, back then they didn't have anything but the Old Testament at that point.
Yep. You're kind of there. God has given us, through his divine power, all things that pertain to life and godliness. What kind of life?
A life that's godly. He's given us the power to live a life that's godly through the holy breath of God.
Yeah, basically he's saying that he's given us everything we need to escape the corruption that is in the world through lust. Right? We are literally without excuse. We have all the tools that we need. We just need to know what they are, how to use them. He continues in verse 5, but also for this very reason, he's talking about the corruption in the world, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, and he kind of builds this list. Now, we studied this back in Tampa several years ago, but it's worth going through again. If Peter said that we've already escaped, because he says this in verse 4, if he says we've already escaped the lust and corruption of the world, why do we need the list that he gives us that goes faith, virtue, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, and so on? Why do we need the list if we've already escaped corruption through lust?
That's past tense. And once you're saved, doesn't mean you never again will ever lust or, have a problems.
Well, wait, what? So you're telling me that you can become ensnared again?
Sure.
Yeah.
That's why we need the list. Like, great, you did a good job yesterday. What about today?
Well, it takes time to build godly character, and you've got to do it purposely. You don't just doesn't happen. You have to exercise
Daily.
build to that.
Yeah, and these things don't happen by accident, right? Is notice back in verse, where is it? He says, through the knowledge. No, I'm missing it. Oh, here it is. Verse 5. Giving all diligence. What does that mean?
Constant hard work and attention.
You got to give it 100%. That's what it means. You got to put everything you have into building this list. Because you might have done a good job yesterday and the day before, but what about the temptations that are going to come to you today, right? So he says, add to your faith virtue and knowledge. And then in verse 6 he says, add to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness. And notice now that the end result is the same Philadelphia and agape that we talked about a couple of lessons ago, right? Our personal development starts with us, with our faith and our virtue and our knowledge, but it ends with who we are with and to our fellow believers. Again, it's that inside-out progression, right? Now, we have a list here. And do you remember what we've taught about lists in ancient languages like Greek? Does the order make a difference? Yeah. So classically in Greek, ancient Greek, whatever's first in the list is the most important thing, right? So everything begins with faith. Probably don't need to talk about that all that much other than to say it's about being convinced that God is who he says he is and he will do what he says he will do. But I want you to notice items number 2 and number 3, and that virtue is placed ahead of knowledge. Virtue is placed ahead of knowledge. Now add that again to the discussion we had very briefly last week about having fellowship with people who have good hearts, but imperfect doctrine. It would seem to me that God prefers virtue over knowledge, but not in an exclusive way. But he would favor a faithful, virtuous, but less well-informed and educated Christian over someone who knows a lot of stuff, but is lacking in either faith or virtue. Which begs the question, what is virtue? Because if you don't understand it, you're going to miss probably the most important point of this whole thing. Someone define virtue.
Somebody in the scripture said somewhere there, who can find a virtuous woman? A person, in other words, it's almost like for godly.
Yeah, I can certainly see the connection. Goodness. You know, the Greek word is, I should say,
standards.
What's that?
High moral standard.
What was that, Brian?
Having those high moral standards and keeping them.
Keeping them, yeah. I like the keeping part because here's the deal. The root of the word that's translated as virtue it's actually related to the word manliness. Right? And that's a touchy subject these days. I mean, obviously Peter's not talking about like toxic masculinity, but virtue means excellence, it means valor, and it refers to achievement or mastery of some kind of a subject or a field of endeavor. And this word virtue is actually used quite rarely in the whole Bible. Right? Peter uses it 4 times, and 3 of those times are here in 2 Peter 1. Paul uses it only once, and it only appears in the Greek Old Testament 6 times, and every single instance refers to the glory and the excellence of God. So it's not like a common word, right? Everything that we need for life as a Christian disciple, first of all, is predicated on our faith. But we know that faith grows and matures, doesn't it? Right? The faith that you have today should be stronger and greater than the faith that you had back when you were first baptized because you have seen God working in your life. You understand more about his nature, his character, his faithfulness, and so on. But Peter, in giving us this list, like he didn't intend for us to look at the list and look at all these items as kind of discrete entities where we acquire one item in its entirety and then we move on to the next one and add that in its entirety. He's talking about an integrated process where one item begins and flows into the next, and everything progresses and grows with this interconnected process in Christ. So we know that knowledge improves faith. We know knowledge and faith and self-control mixed with perseverance leads to godliness. So it's hard to separate them all out, right? They're all interconnected, but Peter puts them in an order of importance, right? When we begin our walk with God, our faith is a tiny little seed that with care and handling grows deep roots and stands tall so that we can weather temptations and weather the storms of life. And the same thing in terms of growing applies to this concept of virtue as well. So Peter again isn't saying like instantly add virtue to your faith as if you can order it off the menu. Like I'll have a faith meal number 2 with a side of virtue. So if Peter is not implying that we become instantly virtuous, when he says add to your faith virtue and he places it before knowledge, what is he really talking about? If it's not a quantum of virtue that he's saying that we must acquire immediately, what's he asking us to do?
You have to grow. It takes time to grow. When you start out as a baby, you can become an adult in 1 week.
Right, but we just said that this kind of growth and maturity doesn't happen by accident. You have to give it everything you have. You have to work at it. So what Peter's talking about is beginning with a commitment to the process of becoming excellent. Because we know and understand that virtuosity requires effort and time. So Peter is saying, take your faith and commit to excellence, and then start learning. And the more you learn and commit to excellence, the more you realize you have to exercise some self-control. You know, I read an article many years ago about how Olympic judges gauge and score world-class gymnastics, right? They have a scale of 1 to 10. And judges will retain the last point, the 10th point, for virtuosity. Meaning that you might have 2 gymnasts who perform the exact same routine with the same technical precision. But the one who gets a 10 instead of like a 9.8 is the one who puts that extra something into their performance that goes beyond the technique and the precision. They put their heart and their soul into it, and it's more than just about the execution of moves. It's the seamless flow, it's the beauty, and it's the art of the craft that shows their mastery. That's the person who gets a 10 out of 10. Just pause and think about your life as a Christian and your commitment to excellence, and whether or not you put it at the front of the list or whether or not you think it's in the list at all, or has it been in your list. You know, the Pharisees, of course, were not virtuous, were they? They had the technique. They had the execution of the jots and the tittles of the law down pat, but they lacked the excellence that has to come from the heart. But as we know, intent of commitment, you know, committing, simply going, oh, I'm committing to excellence and virtuosity is not enough. There has to be follow through. And that's, you know, particularly apt for this time of year, because there's a lot of people who have made resolutions at the turn of the year that are going to fail because they don't have a plan. They have no true path to follow. They have no will to push through the challenges that inevitably come as they're trying to accomplish their goals. But God fixed all of that for us, because Peter just told us his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. He's given us everything we need. And he says it's through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue. So you can't stop at the commitment to virtuosity. The beginning is never the end. To be excellent, to be valorous, to master the art of the Christian life and Christian discipleship, we have to understand who we are in Christ and what our Creator requires of us. Now, as I was trying to picture all of this stuff in my mind and how everything fits together, I started with the notion of building blocks and, faith as the bottom stone, and then stacked on that as virtue and stacked on that as knowledge and so on. But that's too separated. It's too discrete. I don't think it captures this. And like I said, Peter says that all the things we need for life and godliness are given to us through knowledge. And we all know that knowledge of God, again, bolsters our faith, which spurs our commitment to virtuosity. And so you can see how it's all mixed and it's intermingled. And, I started thinking, well, maybe it's better to think of faith as the mortar that holds the bricks of a foundation in place. And I kind of like that, even though it's imperfect, I like that mental image, because we can set Christ as the cornerstone of a wall or a foundation, and the cement, the mortar that holds all the bricks in place, are the things that connect us to him. And he's the one who anchors our virtue. He's the one that anchors our knowledge and our self-control and our perseverance.
Yes.
And we all know that we're taught to conform ourselves to Christ, right? And, Peter quotes several passages in Leviticus where God says, and I've got it up there on the screen there, your Bibles probably say, be holy because I am holy, but the Greek says, become holy because he is holy. And that, again, implies a process. I mean, I hate to tell you, but you're not there yet. Neither am I. Become holy. There's always another step. That is virtuosity, is the constant pursuit of perfection. Even though perfection may not be attainable, it doesn't absolve us of the need to pursue it. And if you think of these mandates, all of the Beatitudes that we've been going through, and what Jesus is doing with the Ten Commandments is he's sharing himself with us. Right? Like every good leader, he first shows us his own virtue before he asks us to become like him. He demonstrated everything first. So with regard to this list, and I want you to listen now, because I'm going to drop a truth bomb here about why Peter starts with faith and starts with virtue. And that's because faith is about God's excellence and virtue is about yours. That's where the Christian life starts. Know God's excellence, start working on your own. Peter starts again with being convinced of God, his excellence, his trustworthiness, then committing yourself to excellence, to master the art and the heart of being a good disciple. And the only way to conform ourselves to his example of excellence is by learning more about him. What pleases him and what displeases him. The next thing on the list, of course, is self-control and perseverance. And those are important because it's hard to say no to yourself, to your own lustful desires, when you don't know why you should. If you have no perception of the cost of taking the bait, if you have no perception of the loss that is associated with certain choices, why wouldn't we do everything that our selfish hearts desire? Why wouldn't we take the bait of our own lust? And the answer to that is because we learn through Christ that lust and selfish desires are a trap, and we understand where those lead in the ultimate end. James said it leads to death, right? So Peter's solution is to grow into maturity and strength by trusting God and committing to excellence, increasing your knowledge. And the key to this is practicing self-control persistently over time. And that's how we develop godliness, training ourselves to consistently not take the bait, not to get ensnared again in the lust that drives the corruption of the world. and our old selves. Now, go back to Matthew chapter 5, because that was Peter's take on combating lust. Jesus has a little bit more striking solution. Now, he narrows the focus, of course, down to sexual lust, right? So Matthew 5:29, this is where he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, cast it from you. Because it's better for your eye to perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you for the same reason. Now, Jesus is using hyperbole here, right? He doesn't literally mean that we should go around blinding ourselves and maiming our bodies. But his point is that some people who really struggle with something like lust have to take extreme measures. But we're kind of squeamish, right? Right? If you go back, Peter talks about self-control. Some of us cringe at ripping off a bandage, right? We don't like going to the dentist. We don't like getting stitches. We don't like getting a flu shot. Imagine how much self-control it takes for you to literally cut off your own hand or pluck out your own eye. I think in the grand scheme of things, we're like tiny little whiny babies who have little stomach for doing hard things. But how do you get to the point where doing hard things becomes easier? By doing hard things. Committing to excellence, committing to virtue, increasing your knowledge, practice, 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 practice. Go to Matthew 23. I'm looking at my time. We'll probably end with this here.
Verse.
We'll go to Matthew 23:25. Back to this main concept is that we can't stress enough that what goes into your heart comes out in your life, right? Whether the portal of entry is your eyes, your ears, your feet, your hands. The easiest way to control your heart and your mind is to control what goes into it. Be selective. The Pharisees apparently taught that a lustful heart wasn't a crime, only the act of adultery was. And Jesus had some choice words that kind of painted and illustrated and revealed the problem. It says in 23:25, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of extortion and indulgence, self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and the dish, that the outside of them may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." When you take God's standard and you shift it, and you downgrade the impact or the importance of an offense, and you change what level of offense gets a particular type of judgment, it's no wonder he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." But this is what Jesus, again, at least certainly with these first two commandments, this is what he's fighting against. They changed the standards. And here's what's worse, is that they taught the people to follow their example.
That's why Jesus says, do as they say, not as they do.
That's exactly right. So I'm going to stop here because there's another part to this whole to the second commandment, which has to do with divorce and adultery. We'll save that for next time because it's not a simple conversation. I mean, it is, but it's lengthy. And so I want to save that so we can develop that just kind of in a single session.